most of us are battling the labels and the structures, the compartments and the fragments that we've been trained to see, trained to give language to, trained to give separation. And moving away from that is hard. It's just plain hard. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right? Well, first of all, thank you to Lisette and all the people who put this beautiful event together. I have to say that the aesthetic of this conversation is most pleasing. And that's important. The dinner last night and being in this environment, I think, is conducive to expanding the boundaries of what we're talking about and what we're thinking about. I was asked to sort of give a little description myself of what it is that I do, what gives me authorization to be here. And the answer is nothing or everything. You choose. I work in many different fields. I work with ecologists and anthropologists. I work with psychologists. I work with artists and educators. I was at Oxford yesterday giving a presentation to a group of people who are trying to think about how to reorganize education. I work in a lot of different fields because my work is about how those fields exist in a context together. So for that reason, the important part of what I'm trying desperately to do is to create a context for a conversation in which we can have a more diverse ecology of ideas, of professions, of knowing. A more diverse ecology of knowing. And that from that, we may be able to see relational linkages, interactions that we might not have been able to see if we were only looking through one lens. So that is my work. As you know, we live in a world in which that is not really part of the way we do things like medicine and education and even ecology exists as an isolated topic. So how do we begin then to look at our world, at each other, at our natural environment, and our institutions that we live within in a way that is more whole? So that we can, in fact, use our sources of study and our research techniques to zoom in and study the details, but be able to zoom out too and see the context. Last night, those of you who were willing and brave, I had a little dance lesson. And in this dance lesson, the way that our dance teachers set it up is they gave us a few isolated moves, and we practiced those isolated moves. They were, in fact, fragmented from the whole dance. They were decontextualized from the dance. Are you with me? But we knew there was a context for the whole dance that these decontextualized pieces fit into. And that's a big difference. So that what we were doing was studying the minutia of movement in that one piece, but we knew that piece was a part of something larger, and that we were going to get to see that and see how it all fit together. That's the part that we don't see so often in our lives. So we deal with the pieces, and we hope to find some crossover. So today we have an opportunity with Jaakko to talk about the relational world that we live in and how we interact, how we make sense of that world, how we come to know in that world. And hopefully not know also. I just started a research institute in Stockholm. I live in Stockholm most of the time. And it's a research institute called the International Bateson Institute. Could come as a surprise. And we are working on exactly this project of developing methodologies in research for not only merging different forms of knowing, but also of expressing another kind of information that comes out of what are those relationships. How can we describe, for example, food in terms of its relationships? How can we describe a family in terms of its relationships? How can we describe an illness in the body in terms of its relationships? A curriculum in education in terms of its relationships? So that's what we're looking at. I'm also a filmmaker and a writer, a teacher. And I put all these pieces together, and at the end of the day, it's not really clear what it is that I do, but I work really hard. We thought it would be fun to start with the film. And then we would get a base for not only the vocabulary of this work, most of which I think you are at least a little bit familiar with, but let's face it, it's really difficult to hold this conceptual model in mind. It's hard. It's hard for all of us. My father, Gregory, was good at it. And when he looked at something, he saw it in terms of its relationships, the patterns it was in. Most of us are battling the labels and the structures, the compartments and the fragments that we've been trained to see, trained to give language to, trained to give separation. And moving away from that is hard. It's just plain hard. And when we slip, we make mistakes. So we thought it would be nice to start with the film because it is a good hour-long exercise in keeping our perception relational. I made this film about four years ago now, and we're going to get at a lot of the ideas and the processes that are in it later on. So let me just give a quick introduction to something I'd like you to keep your eye on today, okay? Which is the question of subjectivity. When I made this film, I was faced with a very difficult question, and the stakes were high. And the difficult question was this: how do you describe a living human being, a living system? How do you describe a living system? How do you incorporate the complexity, the poetry, the difficulties, the expectations of what our descriptions are of a living system? Now, to make the stakes high, I added the fact that that living system is my father. So that makes it complicated. And he's not living. He's very much alive in terms of the relationships of ideas and of memories, but physically he's not here to defend himself. So that process became internalized for me, of how, if he were here by my side, he would be correcting me. He would be there to say, don't box me in. Don't reduce me. Don't make my life linear. Don't complete me. Because that, in fact, is death. So this film is told from the perspective of not necessarily who was Gregory Bateson, which is our expectation in a biography, but the question is more correctly presented as, who is my Gregory Bateson? Because that's actually the only one I can really give you. So the subjectivity in this case is important. And I want to call your attention to that because I'm hoping that this afternoon in our dialogues that we will get deeper into that and play with some of those ideas and concepts of what it is to be subjective in a complex system. How subjectivity is important in looking at relationality. What do we have if we don't have subjectivity? I'm going to be quiet now and turn on the film. Okay, enjoy. Thank you. He was always learning from everyone and everything around him. As a child, I learned from him that learning never stops.
Gregory Bateson challenged us to rethink or to stand back and try to perceive in a different way, to see how reality is actually operating.
He was interested in larger patterns. He was interested in how things are connected, and especially how living things are connected.
Gregory said, "The major problems in the world are the result of the difference between how nature works and the way people think. What does it even mean to change the way we think?"
And he asked the question, what is there about our way of perceiving that makes us not see the delicate interdependencies in an ecological system that give it its integrity? We don't see them, and therefore we break them.
You have a system, and when you poke it here instead of something happening there, it happens that way, or in a barely recognizable dimension, and that's because it's a very complex system.
The nature of the world in which I live and in which I wish you lived, all of you, and all the time. But even I don't live in it all the time. There are times when I catch myself believing that there is such a thing as something which is separate from something else. I hope that may have given you some entertainment, something to think about, and I hope it may have done something to set you free from thinking in material and logical terms when you are, in fact, trying to think about living things.
So I think that gives us a nice base to start from, don't you think? And to begin to really ask ourselves a rigorous question, which is, how do we think about living things? We live in a world that is filled with thinking tools that push us to material and logical patterns, languages, research programs, definitions, labels, categories, diagnoses. And how do we begin to think about communication and relationships and set ourselves free, or at least be aware? Because maybe we can't get free, but maybe we can at least be more aware of what these lenses are that we see through. And that will give us some leverage and some deeper access to our own subjectivity.